Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Nutritional Revolution podcast. We have a returning guest for you guys. If you guys listen to episode 27, we have Dr. Tony Wolf is back, and if you guys missed it, he has his exercise science degree, bachelor's and master's, both from CSU Fresno. He has his doctorate in exercise physio at Penn State, where he's currently doing research, which is what we're going to dive into today. And then he has his own private coaching practice where he works with teams and serious cyclist athletes. So thank you, Tony, for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Of course. So last time when we had Tony on, we weren't doing this new little addition to our podcast yet, so this is going to be Tony's first time doing two truths and a lie. If you guys listen to the last podcast, you might be able to decipher which one is the lie based off of his background and bio from episode 27. But why don't you go ahead, Tony, and share your two truths and a lie with us?
All right. So I wasn't a good student for most of my life. I'm currently training to do my first Ironman triathlon.
Okay.
And I've raced bicycles in 17 different states.
Oh, okay. What do you think, Nia? I can't imagine one is not right. I feel like you were a good student.
Yeah. I might say number two then.
Training for an Ironman. I'm going to say maybe this, I'll go with the cycling one because I feel like one can't be it. The cycling in was it 17 different states? I feel like that's a bit specific and maybe it was like 15 states or something. I feel like that could be the two truths and lies. So don't tell us, but we'll disclose it at the end for the listeners. But so since we saw you last, I don't remember what month that was in, but it was earlier this year. We had you on and we were talking about some research you had been doing. And since then, you've published a bit more research in similar areas, and we're going to dive into that today. Could you give us a little bit of background of maybe a bit of the literature that you guys have published since we've seen you last?
Yeah, I think I maybe kind of explained this last time. I can't remember exactly, but our lab, we do a lot of work, and we broadly were called the microvascular and thermoregulatory physiology lab. And there's a lot of overlap with microvascular physiology and thermoregulatory physiology because the skin, the small blood vessels, the microvasculature in the skin is the kind of function of those blood vessels is a really important component of thermoregulation. So the dilation of those vessels when you get hot, really important, or constriction of those vessels when you're cold. But also the skin microcirculation serves as a really good model for systemic vascular function that's really easily accessible and allows us to do really mechanistic studies to kind of understand the control of vascular, particularly microvascular function. And importantly, the dysfunction in the small blood vessels in the skin tend to precede dysfunction of larger arteries and kind of the systemic vasculature. So it's kind of an antecedent to overall vascular dysfunction and potentially hypertension and cardiovascular disease. So it's a really powerful model that we use. So we kind of do skin vascular function research in both the context of thermoregulation as well as in the context of cardiovascular health.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that so when you say kind of looking at the microvascular can give you an idea of what's going on at maybe a larger vessel level deeper in the body. Yeah.
So the control of the microvessels in the skin is primarily mediated by a molecule called nitric oxide. So the dilation response in response to physiological stimuli, like heating. If you heat the skin, the blood vessels dilate, and that dilation is mediated primarily by the release of nitric oxide, which is a really important cardioprotective molecule that's just really important for overall cardiovascular health. So if you start to have reduced nitric oxide mediated vascular function, that can kind of precede overall cardiovascular dysfunction, hypertension, and eventually cardiovascular disease.
Interesting. And so with the nitric oxide functioning to help with the vasodilation of the blood vessels, that is something that you guys see change with age, correct?
Yeah, it changes with age. It changes with certain disease states, like hypertension. So hypertensive individuals have less nitric oxide availability. People who are hypercholesterolemic, have high cholesterol, tend to have reduced nitric oxide dependent vascular function. And my particular interest is in, racial and ethnic differences in vascular function and cardiovascular disease prevalence. So that's kind of, the cardiovascular research that's kind of the stuff that I'm really most passionate about. That's what I'm kind of studying.
Awesome. We will dive into that, but because we're talking about nitric oxide, I have to ask, and you might not know the answer to this, but of course there are nitric oxide producing supplements in sports nutrition. So I think of like beet-based products, or even like things like beta alanine can have a vasodilatory effect, I believe. Do you, from kind of going through your research, has that ever been something that you've looked at, or what are your thoughts on it, if you have any?
There are there's a lot of literature studying like beetroot juice supplementation or whatever to try to improve vascular function, or kind of improve clinical outcomes in patients with peripheral artery disease, stuff like that. And I think that's not something that I'm as familiar with, but I think it kind of is somewhat context dependent. It works for some people and not others. But my interest, it tends to be less like how we can provide a patch, like a Band-Aid for an issue, and more how do we get at the underlying issues, so we don't need to supplement with things like beetroot juice.
Yeah. Awesome. So let's see. I know there's been a couple studies that you've published since we've spoke last. What one do you want to talk about first?
I'm open for whichever.
Okay.
I guess we can go with the vitamin D stuff first, since that's kind of already broached that a little bit.
Let's dive into it. So can you give us a little bit, almost like summary abstract style of kind of what you were, maybe why you guys were doing the study, what it was looking at, that kind of stuff, and then we can dive into maybe more detail.
Yeah. So, like I said, there are very clear racial and ethnic differences in cardiovascular disease and hypertension prevalence. And there is a decent amount of research over recent years looking at, if you look at young, healthy Black individuals compared to white individuals, despite the fact that they don't have hypertension, they don't have high cholesterol, high glucose, they're healthy. They have reduced vascular function relative to their white counterparts. And those studies have always kind of they take, subjects who identify as either African American or non-Hispanic Black, or, Caucasian American or non-Hispanic white, and compare them and try to understand the mechanisms of underlying reduced vascular function in the non-Hispanic Black or African American cohort. And so there are really good studies done that suggest that increased oxidative stress may be kind of underlying that reduced function. And then follow-up studies where they use certain supplements to try to reduce oxidative stress, right? But again, I kind of go back to what is the underlying, why do those individuals have increased oxidative stress to start with? They shouldn't.
Yeah, interesting.
And so I have worked for the past 5 years on this line of research looking at the influence of ultraviolet radiation exposure on skin blood vessel function. And initially it was kind of thinking it might have a negative effect, and we showed a couple studies that acute UV radiation exposure reduced function in the skin microvasculature over the few hours after exposure. But then the more I thought about it, and the more I was kind of reading and doing that work, it was like, well, but also UV exposure is really important for vitamin D production. And people with darkly pigmented skin, so it's this evolutionary kind of balance where early humans living in, and this is a really long abstract, but I really want to get the proper
I dig
background.
it.
So early humans living in equatorial Africa adapted a darkly pigmented skin to protect, we think, against ultraviolet radiation induced degradation of folate, which is vitamin B9.
Oh, interesting.
And that's really evolutionarily important because folate is important for healthy fetal development and childbirth. So reduced folate or inadequate folate is associated with increased prevalence of neural tube defects and the spina bifida and issues like that. So it would make a lot of sense evolutionarily that you would want to protect bioavailable folate. But then as humans migrated to more northern latitudes where UV radiation exposure is lower, we had a depigmentation that occurred to allow for adequate vitamin D production from the sun. And vitamin D is also really important for maternal health, early childhood development, and all that. So evolutionarily important again. So the idea is that the skin pigmentation was kind of adapted based on regional differences in UV radiation exposure to strike a balance between degradation of folate and adequate production of vitamin D.
This is fascinating, by the way.
I've been really fortunate to work with Dr. Nina Jablonski here at Penn State, who is the biological anthropologist who kind of formulated that hypothesis, which is now the prevailing theory for the evolution of human skin pigmentation. It's really the only theory that's held up over time.
Wow.
So working with her and like reading all that literature, I was like, well, maybe it's vitamin D, inadequate vitamin D, that's leading to vascular dysfunction. The more I read, it's like, okay, yeah, vitamin D is actually important. It has antioxidant properties, so it signals for the production of certain antioxidants endogenously, so within the body. And it's also it has anti-inflammatory properties, and it also may signal for nitric oxide production. So increases expression of endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which is the enzyme that produces nitric oxide. So there's like several different ways that vitamin D may be protective of vascular function and nitric oxide availability. So that's kind of the big background. So I started out with a study that we published in 2020, looking at whether vitamin D supplementation would improve skin blood vessel function in African American subjects. And we found that it did. So it improved vascular endothelial function in those Black or African American participants, but not in the white participants. So it kind of normalized things between the two groups. So we published that study. And then this more recent publication that we have, I wanted to know if we take a really diverse cohort of people with a wide range of skin pigmentation from very lightly pigmented to darkly pigmented, is there an association between skin pigmentation and vitamin D availability? And is there an association between skin pigmentation and nitric oxide dependent vasodilation of those skin blood vessels? And then finally, is there an association between vitamin D availability and nitric oxide dependent dilation? And it turned out that all those things were the case. So there was a negative association between skin pigmentation and vitamin D concentrations and nitric oxide dependent vascular function.
Wow.
So those with more darkly pigmented skin had lower vitamin D concentrations and lower nitric oxide dependent function. And then when we just looked at vitamin D versus vascular function, we found that with increasing vitamin D concentrations, nitric oxide dependent vascular function improved.
That is so fascinating. And so correct me if I'm wrong, in the last study from episode 27 that we went over, where they did supplement with vitamin D, you had the participants that even on like general lab readings, they weren't necessarily like low, quote unquote, low vitamin D, like in their blood plasma, right? But they still supplemented and saw improvements.
Yeah, so everybody supplemented regardless.
Mm.
So we didn't actually test their vitamin D concentrations until the end because
I
we did
see.
it in batch.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know what anybody's serum vitamin D concentrations were at baseline. I didn't know any of it until at the end. We just did it all at once and analyzed it.
Interesting. Wow.
What was interesting is that, I mean, so in the darkly pigmented or like African American cohort, they were, I think every single one of them except for one was vitamin D insufficient or deficient. I think one of them was actually sufficient at baseline.
Mm-hmm.
After 4 weeks of supplementation, where we did 4 weeks of 2,000 IU per day vitamin D supplementation at the end. So actually, I think at baseline, I think that all of them were insufficient or deficient. At the end, I think that all of them but one were insufficient, and one of them got into the sufficient range.
Wow.
I'm not 100% sure, but most of them, regardless, at post supplementation, were still insufficient.
Yeah.
After a month of 2,000 IU per day.
Wow.
But it still significantly improved their skin vascular function. And then in this more recent study, it was 33 participants that we tested in total, again, across a wide range of skin pigmentation, independent of self-identified race or anything like that. Only 6 of the participants were actually sufficient in vitamin D.
Wow.
Regardless of skin pigmentation.
Wow.
Meaning that 27 of them were insufficient or deficient. So,
wow.
Really, it's like almost everybody should be supplementing with vitamin D.
Yeah.
We're in the northeastern region of the United States,
right?
So central Pennsylvania, where even during the summer, a lot of the time the UV exposure isn't strong enough for even lightly pigmented people to be creating enough vitamin D.
Mm-hmm.
And we also live lifestyles now where we're indoors all the time,
Yeah. Yeah. That is very interesting. And I think, you bring up a great point. I mean, with also the invention of sunscreen and everybody's kind of layered up or protecting their skin for like the extreme, the fear of melanoma and stuff like that. Right. But it is very interesting. I mean, do you find if someone has the ability to get sun exposure potentially during our summer months, does the body, like maybe quote unquote air quotes, prefer to make vitamin D from the skin versus getting it orally, or does oral supplementation affect how the body potentially makes its own vitamin D? Do you know?
Yeah, I think so. When you supplement, I don't think there's like 100% efficiency. Like however much vitamin D you're taking, I don't think that 100% of that gets converted to bioavailable vitamin D.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately, once you have adequate bioavailable vitamin D, that's all that really matters. Mm-hmm. But there are those who argue that there are other really important properties of sun exposure for overall health. And I think that that's probably true. So I think that, getting sun exposure is important. It's important for mood and a whole host of factors that helps you sleep better.
Yeah.
Sleep-wake cycles are better if you make sure to get some sun exposure. So there are a lot of important properties of getting some amount of sun exposure. Mm-hmm. But I think that in the context of vitamin D, once you have that bioavailable vitamin D on board, I don't think it really matters where you get it from too much.
Yeah. Do you have a suggested time of day for supplementation of vitamin D, or does that not matter?
No, I don't think it matters. I think
okay. And is there a form of vitamin D that you suggest?
Just like I think whatever, like this, the D2, D3 complex, you get that. That's fine. Awesome. Just whatever you can get over the counter. I use like Nature Made
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And you said even with 4 weeks in that one study of 2000 IUs daily, it moved, it sounds like the majority of the participants potentially up, but still not enough, you're saying
Yeah.
for, okay.
Yeah. Didn't get them into the sufficient range. And so that's not like an endorsement for supplementing with 2000 IU per day indefinitely, right?
Yeah.
But I think that for people who are starting off really like deficient or seriously deficient, that you need a prolonged period of, maybe 2000 IU per day or even more for a while. And then kind of maybe backing off to where you're doing, 600 to 1000 a day or something like that.
Wow. Yeah. What are your thoughts? I know this is kind of off topic of the study, but with like prescriptive, I've had some clients come to me where they're on prescribed vitamin D and it's, 20,000 IUs up, a day. What are your thoughts on kind of like, is that mega dosing of vitamin D? Like,
that seems like a lot. I mean, so
yeah,
I'm not a physician, not that kind of doctor. So I wouldn't make any medical recommendations. If their physician is prescribing that to them, then, I wouldn't tell them not to do it.
Okay.
Consult with your physician. But yeah, I think for the general population, that more than, the endocrine society and stuff, they suggest no more than 10,000 IU per day. Anything less than that should be not toxic as long as for most people, I think even doing 10,000 IU per day for an extended period of time could potentially result in vitamin D toxicity. Vitamin D is fat soluble, so it doesn't get cleared very fast. It has a long half-life, so I'd be careful to not take too much.
Yeah. And I think that's a good thing you point out, is that just like we can be deficient in some of our vitamins and minerals, we can also overconsume and we can get too much. So more is not always better, as one of my clients was saying to me the other day, that you don't necessarily want to load up on all the kale in the world just because someone says it's a good thing. You need some variety. So let's see, you did one other study that we wanted to dive in today, which was in regards to core temperature responses to heat. And I would love to, the title, I want to say the title, but I also want you to define what compensable and uncompensable heat stress is. So for that study, let's see, I'm going to pull that one up here and we'll link these in the show notes for everybody. But the study was core temperature responses to compensable versus uncompensable heat stress in young adults, correct?
Yep.
So, okay. So tell us a little bit, what is compensable and uncompensable heat stress?
Yeah, compensable means that, so during heat stress, whether you're resting or exercising, so let's say exercising, you're creating heat internally through metabolic processes. And then you also have, if it's in a hot environment, you have heat gain from the environment. So you have heat production inside, within your body. You have heat gain from the external environment. Our body is able to dissipate heat through sweating, so the evaporation of sweat, and through like I was mentioning earlier, increased skin blood flow. So we deliver, when we start to get hot, we deliver more blood from our core out to the periphery, out to our skin, to dissipate heat from the skin. And then once the blood passes through the skin, it's cooled, and then it gets sent back to your core. So you have those two mechanisms of dissipating heat, and so you have basically heat balance, like kind of there's an equation for the maintenance of heat balance. So as you start to get hot, you increase how much you're sweating and how much blood is flowing to the skin to dissipate that heat, to offset the heat gain. But and as long as you're able to dissipate as much heat as you're gaining, then the heat stress is compensable, meaning that your body is able to compensate for it.
Okay.
Once heat gain exceeds heat dissipation, that means your body is no longer able to compensate adequately for the amount of heat that you're gaining, which means that, so that's uncompensable heat stress, meaning that you would expect your body temperature, your internal temperature, your core temperature to rise with that magnitude of heat stress.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And then, so I would love for you to break down what this kind of focus that you guys were looking at in the study. And then I wanted to note too, with participants, you guys looked at men and women. So I think that's important to note for our listeners. But if you could break down, I know there's different environments I saw in there, kind of what you noted it as a warm, humid versus a hot, dry. And if we could kind of dive into what all of that stuff is. But again, you could give us an abstract summary of whatever length you feel makes the most sense to explain it.
Yeah, so this is kind of really a side project on a larger project that we have ongoing. It's a 5-year project funded by the National Institutes of Health. And the purpose of that project is actually to look at what we call critical environmental limits. So where the combinations of temperature and humidity above which heat stress becomes uncompensable. So there's a wide range of environments that our body is able to compensate for adequately, right? But eventually the heat and or humidity gets high enough that our body's no longer able to compensate, and core temperature starts to rise continuously for a given metabolic rate in that environment. So our lab has done a lot of work in the past looking at age-related changes in our ability to regulate our core temperature. So how our ability to produce sweat changes, how our ability to deliver blood to the skin changes. But what we don't really know is how that translates to the real world. So when does that matter, those age-related changes? So the goal of this project is to look at age-related critical environmental limits, so those upper limits for the maintenance of heat balance. And we're looking at that across a wide range of environments. So and they're all pretty hot, quite warm to very hot, and from very humid to very dry. So, think like Georgia or Florida in the summer versus Death Valley in the summer. That's just within the United States, right?
Right.
So really wide range of environments. So one of our PhD students, Rachel Cottle, took on this investigation to look at, so we were interested to know in those compensable environments. So those environments that are just below the critical environmental limit are like barely compensable, right? So really we have a little bit of heat gain, a little bit of a rising core temperature that we kind of see like a very slow slope. And then we see that break point where we reach that critical limit and core temperature really starts to rise a lot faster. And so our studies, the first couple that we published really got a lot of publicity. And, in the press, they kind of want to sensationalize it. It's like, well, once you're in these environments, you're going to die in 6 hours. So you can't, well, that's not necessarily true.
Right.
And so then we thought about it like, okay, well, how long would it actually be if you were in these different environments below, like during the compensable heat stress and the uncompensable heat stress? How long would it take you to hit a core temperature that is associated with heat stroke? So, because a lot of people are like, well, you're going to experience heat stroke if you're in these conditions. It's really important to note that heat stroke is defined as a core temperature above 40 degrees Celsius, accompanied by neurological dysfunction. So you'll see people get really confused. They kind of maybe don't know where they are. They start to stumble around. There's notable neurological dysfunction in people who are experiencing heat stroke, and that can be quickly followed by systemic organ failure. So it's a really, really life-threatening medical emergency.
Right.
But not everybody who reaches 40 degrees Celsius experiences heat stroke. So especially in athletes, you'll see people exceed 40 degrees Celsius frequently without experiencing heat stroke. They may experience heat exhaustion, cramps, but not heat stroke. So I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. So we're not saying that if you hit 40 degrees Celsius, you're going to have a heat stroke. But we wanted to know, how long would it take you to get to that core temperature that's associated with heat stroke, or at least highly increased risk of heat stroke?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what the purpose of this study was to look at those slopes of the gain in core temperature below and above that critical environmental limit, and then use that to calculate how long it would take you to reach that 40 degrees Celsius.
Interesting. Out of curiosity, do you find, I mean, I know you mentioned at that 40 degrees Celsius, not everybody will experience heat stroke. Do you think that there's like a training adaptation to that, or a hydration component? Can someone hit 40 degrees and still be very well hydrated and still be able to maybe compensably cool themselves? Or like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think typically during compensable heat stress, you're unlikely to see core temperatures exceed 40 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
Probably going to be an uncompensable exposure regardless of hydration status or whatever. But yeah, I mean, so there may be a training effect. People who are heat acclimatized or acclimated may tolerate that, getting that hot better than those who are not acclimated or acclimatized. I don't think it's very clear what exactly the factors are. That it seems like there are some people who are just more prone to it for some reason or another, and there's ongoing research to try to better understand that.
Yeah, so interesting.
A study that was just published from the United States Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine, USAREM. In a large number of Army troops, and looking at like sex, whether sex or BMI, or what individual characteristics are associated with increased risk of experiencing exertional heat stroke. And BMI was predictive of, that people who had higher BMIs tended to have higher incidence of heat stroke.
Interesting.
But it's not very clear.
Yeah. So, I mean, so many questions, I think, right? To kind of, I don't know, it makes me think about like all the microvascular stuff too, that you're researching. Do some individuals have better compliance and maybe others not so much? And could that contribute? It's very interesting.
So I mean, if you have better thermoregulatory response, if you have better sweating responses and skin blood flow responses, you're likely to be able to compensate for the heat stress for longer time, or higher levels of heat stress. But once it becomes uncompensable and you're just rising, then it kind of is what it is. Yeah.
Very interesting. I have to tell you a story while we're talking about this. My husband and I were talking randomly, and we were talking about what physiological change are humans going to evolve with, like what's going to be the next change, I guess is the best way to say that. And he said that we were going to be able to get better at tolerating warmer temperatures because the planet is heating up. And it kind of makes me think about all this stuff. Like, is that something that you think is realistic with our bodies? Like, could we evolve to tolerate warmer temperatures?
Yeah, I mean, we are tropical animals. We are pretty good at, adapting to a wide range of environments. It's hard to say, as the planet gets hotter, how well we're going to be able to adapt physiologically. But I mean, if you look at, regional differences around the world, people who are living in Canada aren't able to withstand the same amount of heat stress as somebody who's living in Southeast Asia.
Right.
So when we look at epidemiological studies looking at morbidity and mortality from extreme heat events, they typically look at it in terms of the 90th or 95th percentile for a given region. The 90th or 95th percentile in India is going to be a lot higher than it's going to be in Canada,
Right.
or Iceland, or, so there clearly is some amount of adaptation that occurs. If you're being exposed to higher temperatures all the time, you will adapt physiologically to those higher temperatures. But I mean, I think that, there is an upper limit. I don't know. I don't think we know what it is. And it's definitely hard to say how well we'll actually adapt to it,
So fascinating.
Like if we'll be able to evolve to better tolerate a warmer climate.
So interesting. Okay, so with your studies, you mentioned, or with the recent study that we're talking about, the warm, humid versus hot, dry exposure. Can you tell us a little bit about how long these participants were exposed to these situations, or how frequency, like how did the study design work for you guys?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and unique study design. So we have 2 environmental chambers housed within our laboratory building, and they're fully controllable. So they allow us to control the temperature and the humidity within the chamber. It's a big chamber.
Wow.
So we have a couple treadmills and some bikes, and so the different environments we have, environments where we keep the temperature constant the whole time and we ramp the humidity throughout, or where we keep the humidity constant and ramp the temperature throughout. So the subjects come in, we start them, in all these young healthy subjects they each did 2 metabolic rates in 2 different environmental conditions. So a total of a minimum of 4 conditions.
Okay.
The 2 metabolic rates, one is on a treadmill, just walking, kind of like it is supposed to approximate leisurely walking. And then on the other condition is on a recumbent bicycle, and they're pedaling with 0 resistance at the pedals, with a cadence of 40 to 50 RPM. So it's a really, really low metabolic rate, just a little higher than rest.
Okay.
And the idea with that was to kind of approximate activities of daily living that you might be expected to be doing inside your home during a heat wave. So if you're kind of sitting watching TV and then you get up and you wash the dishes or brush your teeth, or just kind of minimal activity, kind of the average metabolic rate we would expect with that kind of free living.
Interesting. And again, both men and women were in the study.
So they come in and they'll be randomized to a certain environmental condition, and either the treadmill or the bike. And the first 30 minutes, the environmental conditions are held constant. So the temperature and humidity stay the same. And that allows their core temperature to kind of equilibrate. So their core temperature starts to rise. And that's really in proportion to the metabolic rate associated with the activity they're performing, rather than the actual environmental conditions. Across a wide range of environmental conditions, for a given metabolic rate, your core temperature will kind of equilibrate at the same temperature. So we see it equilibrate, and then we start to ramp either the humidity or the temperature while keeping the other variable constant. And we ramp it every 5 minutes by either 1 degree Celsius or 1 millimeter of mercury water vapor pressure. So that's absolute humidity, not relative.
Okay.
And we'll just ramp it by 1 degree or 1 millimeter of mercury every 5 minutes until we see the core temperature so we see that inflection and see it rise for generally at least 15 to 20 minutes to confirm that it is a true inflection.
Wow. And with kind of diving into a little bit of the results there, did you notice a difference in how quickly the core temperature heated up in a humid versus a hot, dry environment out of curiosity?
Man, yeah, I have to jog my memory on that one. So there was, I believe, a difference between a warm, so not how long it took for the core temperature to equilibrate, but there was a little bit of a difference in the slope of core temperature during that equilibration phase between warm, humid, and hot, dry environments. So it was significantly different between the two environments, but it was still just a really low rate of rise in core temperature.
Interesting. And the one thing I wanted to point out too that I saw in the study, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I saw in there that says there was no difference between sexes.
Correct.
Awesome. Yeah. And then I also saw in there what you mentioned, but you had noted in the paper, larger bodies performed differently in the heat.
Yeah, it was a little unclear. So there was one condition, I think it was during the treadmill walking in hot, dry environments.
Okay. We'll link the paper in the show notes too for people that want to dive into it.
So we looked at, the relation between different, characteristics like fitness, VO2 max, and one of the ones that we looked at was body surface area to mass ratio, which is a kind of an important determinant of our ability to thermoregulate. So all of our thermoregulation is done through the surface of our skin, right? That skin environment interface. So we evaporate sweat from the skin, and that cools us, and then the skin blood flow cools us. So having a larger skin surface area means more surface area from which to dissipate heat. But larger body mass means more metabolic heat production, especially during weight-bearing activities like walking on the treadmill. So we look at that ratio of skin surface area to body mass as kind of an index of, it's a kind of thermoregulatory predictor, I guess you could say. Those with a larger body surface area to mass ratio tend to have a thermoregulatory advantage. And so that's where we found in that one specific environment, I'm pretty sure it was on the treadmill in hot, dry environments, there was an association there.
So can you say that one more time? You said larger bodies had a thermoregulatory advantage?
A larger body surface area to mass ratio.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. It kind of seems like there's maybe like an efficiency sweet spot when it comes to core temperature management, maybe with regards to an individual's body weight, potentially.
Yeah, so it's really interesting when we do thermoregulatory studies, there are like all these factors to take into account. So higher aerobic fitness, those with higher aerobic fitness tend to thermoregulate better. So, when we're training aerobically, we get hot, right? Just through that. So we have some amount of kind of low grade heat adaptation or acclimation that occurs through aerobic exercise training. So those who are more aerobically trained actually tend to thermoregulate better. So a higher VO2 max typically is associated with better thermoregulation. And so when we look at, sex differences or age differences, men tend to have a higher VO2 max than women. And young adults tend to have a higher VO2 max than older adults. That's not universally true, but on average, that is true. Conversely, women tend to have a larger body or a larger skin surface area to mass ratio, right? Which is thermoregulatory advantageous. Advantageous in terms of thermoregulation. So they're like these kind of competing things. Men have a higher VO2 max, women have a higher surface area to mass ratio. And kind of a lot of things that, are you have to consider when designing studies to look at sex differences, and the purpose of these studies aren't necessarily to look at sex differences, but we're testing
Right.
on people that we can.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of confounding variables that make it really hard to tell whether there's an effect of sex per se, biological sex, or if it's these other things that are associated with biological sex.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That makes me think too, like people who have a improved VO2 max, it's likely because they're maybe doing, I mean, there's a genetic component to that part, right? But also maybe they're fit. And so that might mean a lighter body weight.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I think typically like a higher VO2 max just kind of naturally, I don't know if that certainly wouldn't confer as much of a thermoregulatory advantage as a training induced elevation in VO2 max.
I see. Yeah.
Again, that the actual aerobic training, elicits some amount of heat stress endogenously, regardless of the environment. And that kind of creates a low grade acclimation.
So interesting. I want to be mindful of your time here. So we got to go over our 2 truths and a lie reveal. And then I'd also love for you to share what's kind of coming up next for you in regards to research and all that stuff. But could you give us a refresher on what your 2 truths and a lie were?
Yeah, I wasn't a good student for most of my life. I am currently training for my first Ironman triathlon, and I've raced bicycles in 17 states.
Okay. What is your lie, Tony?
Training for my first Ironman. So Nia.
Oh, Nia.
Yeah, I've always said that I would do a triathlon if it weren't for the running or the swimming.
Yeah, there you go. I think you maybe told us that in the first episode. I should have known. Awesome. And so let's see what's coming up for you guys at Penn State research, or you personally, anything coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, I have a couple of grants in the cooker. So with my skin pigmentation stuff, which is, really, like I said, kind of my primary area of interest moving forward, I have a grant in which would be of particular interest, I think, because I'm trying to look at sex differences.
Neat.
So if there are sex-specific mechanisms by which vitamin D improves vascular function in darkly pigmented individuals.
Yeah.
And then with that NIH funded project, the HEAT project, we're really just collecting a lot of data on middle-aged and older adults right now. So all of our published studies so far have been in young, healthy people. That project got delayed quite a bit by the pandemic. Got funded right before the pandemic hit. And then so we couldn't test anybody for a while. And then we got approved to test young, healthy individuals who are the lowest risk, right, for about the first year. So we collected a ton of data in young, healthy adults, early on. So now we're just kind of doing a lot of testing in middle-aged and older adults, and hopefully those data will start to be coming out in publication over the next 6 months to a year.
Awesome. We'll keep our eyes peeled. We'll have to have you back for part 3. You're gonna have to think of 3 new 2 truths and a lie.
Yeah.
And where can people find you? Are you on the socials or your coaching website or anything like that?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. It's Tony __Wolf, so 2 underscores.
Awesome.
ATP Coaching, ATP _coaching on Instagram, or Dr. Tony Wolf on Instagram.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. And we'll include the 2 studies we talked about in the show notes. And then for the listeners, if they want to jump back to episode 27 and give that a listen as well to hear the first study we were talking about that Tony did. So thank you so much for your time today, Tony. This was fascinating as usual.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.